Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you so much for being with me for today's episode. I am very excited about today's episode because we have a very special guest. And I trust that this episode and the next will be a blessing to you as we visit with Dr. Mark Laaser. So let me start by just saying, Dr. Mark, thank you for being here. And I appreciate the chance to meet you and get to visit.
Well, thanks for having me. I always enjoy doing these, and I've been looking forward to it. So
thank you. And in the way of introduction, I'm sure that many of our listeners already know who you are, but Dr. Mark Laaser is considered an expert and a Christian leader in the field of sexual addiction and recovery. And together with his wife, Debbie Laaser, they have over 30 years of personal experience in sexual addiction recovery. They operate the Faithful and True Counseling Center in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, which is near the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. And through Faithful and True, Dr. Laaser offers workshops for men, women, and couples, as well as professional counseling services for men, women, and couples. And Dr. Laaser has written, I think, 12 books on the topics of sexual addiction and recovery. He's a sought-after speaker on the subject. So truly, Dr. Laaser is an expert in this field and really a pioneer, going all the way back into, should we say, the 80s, Dr. Laaser, or the 90s at least. You were one of the first Christian leaders really to forge into this field of sex addiction and sex recovery. And you've been a leader, so we just deeply appreciate the work you've done and all the people you've helped through your work.
Well, it does go back to the 1980s. I was intervened on for my own sexual addiction in 1987 in March, and I was shipped off to the first inpatient treatment program for sex addiction that was founded by Dr. Patrick Carnes, the founder of the field. So I went there for 30 days and had my first 30 days of sobriety. And that's March 17th when I entered the doors of the hospital is the date that I consider my sobriety birthday these days. So I've been sober roughly 32 years, something like that.
Wow. Congratulations. Praise be to God.
Yeah.
Thank God that His grace and mercy are very powerful, and God is in the business of healing deeply broken people and deeply broken marriages.
Yeah. I would say if we're willing, because there's so much about addiction that is rebellion against God, and there's so much of addiction that I think is original sin, meaning that, like Adam and Eve in the garden, we rebel against God's commandments. And so I think one of the first things we need to think about is, and I know I had to think about, is I needed to stop rebelling. I needed to stop, in a way, being angry at God and learn how to lean on God. And, given some of my upbringing and some of the things that happened to me, that was a hard thing to do, but that's been the development of my own spirituality over the years.
That's really very beautiful and very well said. And when you were saying that, you know what it made me think of, Dr. Mark? In the book of Daniel, I think, King Nebuchadnezzar was a pagan king, and that deal happened where he went like insane. And it says that he went out and he crawled around on all fours like a cow, and his fingernails grew out like an eagle, and his hair grew down past his shoulders, and he kind of went insane.
Yeah.
And then after that, it says he raised his eyes toward heaven and his sanity was restored.
Yeah.
And so the raising of the eyes to heaven kind of speaks of a submission to God, an acknowledgement of God. He realized his need for God, and he brought himself into submission to God and compliance to God, and it restored a kind of equilibrium and sanity to his life. So as we align ourselves with God, it brings health and wholeness and healing.
Exactly. And addiction could be, easily defined as that craziness that Nebuchadnezzar had. We all start neglecting ourselves and doing lots of other things. But yes, the place to begin is to recognize our own powerlessness, like Paul did in Romans 7:15, when he said, "The good that I would, I don't do, and the evil that I hate, that's what I do." And I think Paul says that that's the condition we're going to be in until we completely sell out to the Lord's control. So,
Amen.
I think a lot of sex addicts that consider themselves Christian, they really are. I mean, they've made that commitment, but they've held back their sexuality. They say, "Lord, you can have every area of my life, but don't touch sexuality because I'm the one in control of that." So it's finally when we're able to surrender our sexuality to Christ that we start making progress.
In view of what you just said, and we're getting on a rabbit trail here, I have some questions, but I'm just going to flow with it here because what you're saying is so intriguing. So many Christian men, I would advocate, and I relate to this because I myself struggled with my own sexual addiction for many, many years that I didn't understand. I became a true Christian when I was 16 years old. I understood for the first time in my life who Jesus was and what Jesus did for me.
Yeah.
And so I asked Jesus to be my savior.
Sure.
And when I understood that, it like answered all the big questions of life to me.
Yeah.
It made life make sense. And I fell in love with God immediately. And it like explained the purpose of my life. I knew this explains my life. I'm going to live for God the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So I fell in love with God. I immediately felt a call into ministry. I decided to go to Bible college to study. But at the same time, I had this horrible duplicity in my life where I was acting out sexually in contradiction to my own theology, my Christianity, and my conscience.
Sure.
And I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I would pray to God over and over again, "God, take this away from me. Why am I like this? Change me, God. Fix me with this sex thing."
Yeah.
And I would cry out to God, but it feels like no matter what I did, I was powerless. It's like sex held power over me and it compelled me because I hadn't dealt with my addiction yet.
Well, I think we all have those prayers early on. The first time I remember praying those prayers for God to just simply take this away, I was 12 years old. I was at a church camp. I had already accepted Christ at that point because I'm a preacher's kid, by the way. So you're going to get encouraged to do that early on.
Right.
And I felt that was a sincere experience. But I went to a church camp and I'm 12 years old. And by the time I get to the camp, I've been looking at pornography now for over a year. And at the final commitment ceremony at the camp, I just asked God to take away all lust and all looking at porn. And when I went away from the camp and figured out that God hadn't just magically, washed it away, then I had to go through a period of time where I was kind of angry with God for not answering the prayers in the way that I wanted him to answer them. So, and the consistent message I got back from God is, that I can heal you, but you have to do some of the work. I'm not going to just magically take it away. So
that's right. I like to call it a working cooperation. I feel like we enter into this working cooperation with God.
Yeah.
As we do our part, then God does his part.
That's exactly right.
But we have to do our part,
If we're not willing, one of the spiritual questions we teach at our men's workshop is the story of the man at the pool of Bethesda in John chapter 5. Bible says he's an invalid, and the Greek word is asthenia, which means asthenia is used in the medical condition myasthenia gravis. So he had a neurological disorder in his legs that made it impossible for him to walk. But the word asthenia also means a spiritual weakness. So Jesus simply asked him the question, "Do you want to get well?" And the guy has to, answer that he's willing to be well. And then I teach the guys, when you're willing to be well, then you're willing to do whatever it takes to stay sober.
That's right. And so you come to the place where you're ready to buckle down, and no matter what it takes, you begin
No.
the journey. I think part of that maybe has to do with that old adage. It says something like, until the pain of staying the same is so horrible,
Mhm.
it motivates you to overcome the pain of change.
Yeah, right, exactly. Change is so hard. And we do tend to gravitate back toward the normal. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is the story of the Exodus, where God has revealed himself in so many ways in terms of taking care of the Egyptians. And they finally get out in the wilderness and they get frightened. And where do they want to go? They want to go back to Egypt because that's normal. And so, in recovery, we all have to resist the temptation to go back to normal, to make the changes that do require a lot of courage at times and feel totally uncomfortable and give us a sense of anxiety. That's why we've always believed we're going to need a community of men around us encouraging us to continue the change.
Absolutely. Recovery is not a solo sport.
No, it's not. I've never known a man recover on his own.
Right. So, Dr. Mark, on your website, it says Mark and Debbie Laser know firsthand the pain and devastation associated with sexual addiction. You touched on your story there, what happened, I think you said in 1987.
Right.
Would you mind sharing just a little bit more of your story with us? What did that look like?
Sure.
What happened?
Well, first of all, my story starts in my bedroom. When I was 2 and 3 years old, my father, the pastor, would come in and tell me stories from the Bible, primarily the Old Testament. So, like when you tell the story of Daniel or Nebuchadnezzar or whatever, those are the kind of stories my dad would talk about. But he would also, at the same time, engage me in sexual activity with himself. And he quit when I was about 3 because I think that's when he thought maybe my memory would kick in, that my memory had long since kicked in.
Wow. Dr. Mark, I'm so sorry. I never knew this part of your story. That's incredibly powerful and significant.
Yeah, well, it totally is, because it confused me about sexuality at the time, but I wouldn't have known the word sexuality. I had no concept. I had no concept that a father having that level of contact with the son was abnormal. I had nothing to compare it to. So
of course,
I just kind of accepted it, assumed it, and moved on. Finally, when I was 11, one of my friends, is so often the case with the men that come here, has a friend introduce them to porn, or they find their father's collection of it. And so I started looking at, back in my day, 1961, Playboy magazines, because that's pretty much mainly what we had. And then, as you see, even in our culture, sex addiction progressing, we just got more and more explicit materials, Penthouse and Hustler magazine, eventually the cable movies, and then eventually VHS tapes, and then eventually DVDs, and then in the mid 90s, the big explosion happened when the internet came along, and the internet, even in its early days, was controlled by organized crime. A lot of people don't know that, but 80% of the internet in the early days was controlled by organized crime. They bought up all the popular domain names, like whitehouse.com is still a porn site. Whitehouse.gov is the official site of the White House. So Cinderella.com is a porn website. So they were figuring out ways to trick or trap or accidentally introduce pornography into homes. And so I consider that a massive amount of invasion. I testified in front of Congress about this, and the director of the FBI at the time, Louis Freeh, talked about all the technology that organized crime developed to allow us to pay for stuff online, to allow for the pop-ups to happen, all of that kind of thing. So the comparison is like to the cigarette industry, where they were really attempting to get younger kids hooked on smoking early, so they could capture that market. So we've been up against it in terms of the internet being the major vehicle. And today we know that the cell phone, the smartphone, is the number one source of pornography in the world.
Wow. It just has to do with accessibility. Imagine a guy is walking around, he's got his phone in his hand.
Yeah.
You have an unlimited supply of pornography literally at your fingertips. It's one or two buttons away. And that's a huge temptation for a guy to resist. Even a Christian man, he's going to resist it. He's committed to resist it. And maybe he's doing good for months and months at a time. But my goodness, any guy, is going to have a bad day. You're depressed. You're discouraged. You're mad at God. You had a fight with your wife. And in a moment of weakness, you succumb to the temptation.
Sure.
And you look. And then once you look, it feels so good. And there's the dopamine explosion in your brain.
Yeah.
You're tempted to look again. And after you do it a little bit, then, it gets harder and harder to resist.
And gets easier and easier to do.
Right.
Once you've crossed certain boundaries, they get easier to cross again. So, and pornography and masturbation for a lot of the guys won't stay at that level. It will lead them into other activities. These days, the internet is being used for arranging sexual encounters. There are hundreds and hundreds of websites purely devoted to making sexual connections between people, not emotional connections, just, blatant sexual connections. So, I've often said in my lectures that, if I wanted to act out tonight with another woman, not a prostitute, but another woman, I would simply need to go on one of the social sites and put in my information. I'm sure I'd have a number of responses and could arrange a connection by this evening. So, that's how devastating the internet can be.
Wow. So we kind of got off on a rabbit trail there, but you started sharing with us your story, what happened with your father, and then you found your friend showed you the porn when you were 11. Where do we go from there in your story?
Well, okay, so that led to masturbation, and that led to, an ongoing monthly use of pornography. The Playboy magazine came out every month, and so I would go down to the local drugstore and basically steal it, and I'd hide it in my home and take it out and learned how to masturbate and all that. So I was doing that in high school. In the meantime, I was kind of a fairly tame preacher's kid, so I was dating and I was not pushing the envelope there because this was the 60s and a lot of us just weren't pushing the envelope. But my senior year in high school, I met my wife. And we became high school sweethearts, and we stayed together all the way through college. And then finally in seminary, when I was in seminary, we got married, and she came to live with me at the seminary I was at. And I was assuming, like all the men do, that when I have regular sexual access to a spouse, then I would be fine. I wouldn't need to masturbate or look at pornography again. And sex between the two of us was, in fact, quite good. We had done a lot of studying going into it, and we hadn't had intercourse until the honeymoon night. So, and it was all good. But we're no sooner home from the honeymoon than kind of a more general pattern sets in, and there are nights when Debbie's not going to be feeling the energy or feeling the desire, and that's a common dynamic that the husband and wife have different levels of desire. And when I went off on the honeymoon, I took with me in my brain 10 years of experience of looking at pornography. So I literally had thousands of faces and bodies in my head when I was engaging in my very first act of sexual intercourse with my wife. It was totally unfair to her what I brought into the room. And I regret to this day that before we engaged in our first sexual intercourse, that I didn't sit us down and take time to pray, with her, that for the next 50 years, God help us to have, a totally healthy sexual relationship. And to me, that's defined as healthy sexuality is the expression of the spiritual connection between a husband and a wife.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That was really beautiful the way you said that, doctor. So you get married, you're thinking marriage is going to fix my problem and my struggle with sex, but now you're married and it doesn't fix it. So where do you go from there?
Well, what does a kind of a classic addict do? I literally justified going back to pornography and masturbation because I thought I really didn't want to get into the arguments about frequency that I knew were so common for couples. So one of the things I know today is that I had so much sexual energy to push and promote sex that Debbie had to kind of learn how to resist that at times because she knew there was something more that needed to be a part of it, and that was that spiritual connection. The first act of sexual intercourse in Genesis 4:1 between Adam and Eve, the verb that's used for sex is the Hebrew term yada, which means to know. But David uses it in the Psalms all the time to describe knowing God. So an act of sexual intercourse between a couple should be an act of knowing God together. And that's something that Debbie and I had no concept of in the early days of it.
To know one another, but to also know God. That's very, very beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, right.
So how did it play out then in your story as the early years of your marriage are unfolding? Are you beginning to act out on the side more and more, or what's going on?
No, that's exactly right. So, I just returned to masturbation and pornography, and now we're into the 70s. Debbie and I got married in 1972. So now I'm at a secular university graduate school of religion, and you'd think I'd have access to some mentors and guides, but no one was really talking about this then. But it was the free love generation. So now we had the pill. Now we had women's liberation, and women were getting more aggressive about their own sexuality. If you look at the average issue of Cosmopolitan magazine, you can see how women are being taught to be a lot more sexually aggressive. And so, yes, my addiction graduated or escalated to having sexual encounters with other women during that period of time of my graduate school. And that just continued, and I wasn't telling Deb about it. I was doing it secretly. I was pretty good at lying and deception. And we started having a family, and I just started having more and more sexual encounters. And that just kept going on until 1987, when one of the women that I was involved with finally reported me to the board of directors of the counseling center where I was working. And they called me into a meeting one day, unbeknownst to me. And they went around the room and told me how angry they were with me. And then, of course, they told me I was fired from every one of my jobs, counseling, teaching at the local Christian college, preaching at a church on a Sunday morning. It was all gone within the space of like 5 minutes.
Wow.
But there was a recovering alcoholic in the room, and he was a physician, actually. And he came up to my chair, and all the other people had been angry, but Dr. Palscher didn't look angry. He basically just extended his arms to me, and I fell into his arms, and he whispered in my ear, I don't think your sins with sex are any different than mine were with alcohol. And that was an immense statement of grace. And then he said, I've heard that there's a new treatment center for this up in the Minneapolis area, and I'll check it out for you, and I'll have the information by this afternoon. And if you want to get assessed up there, I'll see that you get to treatment, which he did. He basically paid for my plane flight to get up to Minneapolis. And I went through 30 days with Dr. Carnes. that was my first 30 days of sobriety. So then I graduated, and at that point had to figure out how to maintain my program. And that's when I started getting creative about establishing what I needed, including establishing in the city where I was living the very first 12-step group for sex addiction.
Wow. What a powerful story. I'm wondering if you could speak to, well, I'm interrupting myself because I just want to mention, thank God for that man who extended that moment and that word of grace, and then that action of grace and mercy to you when the others almost, there was a spirit of judgment and anger and rejection.
Yeah.
And this man emerges with this grace to help you.
Yeah.
And thank God for that man. God bless him.
Yeah, well, he was an angel in the room that day, I think. And it was a moment of grace, and it was just enough to get me through the shock of thinking at that point that my entire ministry career was over, because, I was fired from every job. And my own denomination at the time said, don't call us, we'll call you. And 30 years later, I'm still waiting for that call.
Right. Well, could you speak to the issue of duplicity for a moment? Just because I'm thinking, what was it like for you? Because you were in the ministry, right? You were a preacher's kid. You loved God. You were serving God. You were being used by God. But at the same time, there was this horrible duplicity that you were acting out sexually in violation of your theology, in violation of your conscience, in violation of your faith, in violation of your marriage.
Right.
How did you justify that? I mean, were you tormented in your soul? How did you deal with that duplicity? And I'm asking for a reason, because a lot of people listen to this podcast, and I have no doubt that there's men listening right now that are living in this very place of duplicity.
Yeah.
Because they're acting out. They haven't been caught yet. Okay. They know they should not be doing the things they're doing. It's in violation of their faith, in violation of their marriage, in violation of their conscience. And they're doing this stuff, and they know they shouldn't be doing it. And yet they're going to church, and maybe he's the preacher, maybe he's the Sunday school teacher. He goes to men's group. He goes on mission trips. He's serving God.
Right.
And yet there's this duplicity. How did you handle that duplicity in your life?
Well, certainly when I got in recovery, I tried to get rid of the duplicity, which we sometimes call the double life, and we sometimes refer to as compartmentalization. So, I had my public self, the preaching self, the teaching self, the counseling self that the world knew about. And then I had this totally private life, which nobody knew about other than the women that I was acting out with. And I justified it, that I was entitled. That's a word we use all the time. And I just went back to some of the complaints that I had about the sexual frequency in our marriage, that, given the fact that wasn't going to be as frequent as I would have liked, that somehow justified me to go out and get my own needs met.
Wow. So what would you say to that man that I just mentioned that's listening to this, that's struggling in this place of duplicity within himself right now?
Right.
What advice would you have for him?
Well, the first thing I think we all need to do is get to a place of accepting our own powerlessness. That all the attempts that we have made to stop have not been successful. We are, in fact, angry at God because we've wanted God to just simply take it away. So we're using, in a way, the anger at God that we have for not answering our prayers in the ways that we want, but we're using that anger to justify acting out and rebelling against God. I think there's a lot about this duplicity that's pure and simple. It's the same kind of rebellion that was present in the Garden of Eden when God told Adam and Eve what they couldn't do, and they rebelled against that.
Wow. I call it the seduction of pain. I'm seduced by my own pain. If my feelings are hurt, I'm upset. I feel like life isn't fair.
Yeah.
My wife isn't having sex with me as much as I think we should have sex. Things
Yeah.
like I feel pain. And therefore, it's easy for me to justify to myself, I have the right to do this. I'm going to do what makes me feel good. This sense of entitlement leads me in a very unhealthy direction.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is. And you can see that if my wife is not taking care of me, God is not healing me, therefore I deserve to get my needs met. And I've been using the neurochemistry of sexual arousal to lift me out of emotions that I don't like having, like loneliness and sadness and anxiety and boredom and those kinds of things. And I literally thought that it was the way that I took care of myself so that I could function in the other life, so that I could not be depressed or not be anxious and do the things that were in fact serving the Lord. So I thought in a very strange, convoluted way that by acting out, I was actually facilitating my otherwise ability to do ministry.
Wow. Isn't that something? It's amazing the capacity of a human being, of the human heart, the human mind, to justify and rationalize and minimize and explain away. There's a verse in the Bible that says, every man is right in his own eyes.
That's right. That's right.
Hey guys, I hate to do it, but I see from the clock that we're out of time for today's episode, so I do need to jump in here and interrupt. But you are very welcome to come back next week as we continue this interview with Dr. Mark Laaser. And I just want to say that I feel incredibly blessed to have the opportunity to speak with this man, because he is a very significant person and God has used him in a remarkable way. He truly is one of the pioneers and one of the founding fathers within Christianity that began to deal with and research and to work with folks around the issues of sexual brokenness and sexual addiction. So Dr. Mark has been around for a long time. He's helped a lot of people, and I'm very blessed to have this opportunity. I really, really wanted to get him as a guest on the podcast, so I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity for this interview. But anyway, come back next week for part 2, and you will be blessed. I'll look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, have a great week and have a great day. Be blessed in Jesus' name as you continue on your pursuit and your pathway of sexual purity. God bless you, and we'll see you right back here next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.